Niger Delta. It may sound to you like a name of gangster groups, but it's actually a place where the kingdoms of Benin and Oyo and other historical city-states formerly called home is now known as the Niger Delta. In addition to these, the Niger Delta has additional regions that were formerly governed by other ethnic and tribal groups. The first Europeans arrived in the 15th century and started trading goods including spices, textiles, and slaves. Due to the need for machine lubrication during the Industrial Revolution, the Niger Delta started exporting palm oil in the 19th century when it was placed under British control. Following the 1956 discovery of crude oil in Oloibiri, Nigeria gained its independence from the United Kingdom, and it was the beginning of oil conflicts. To know more, let's get into the case study. The nation was organized into regional administrations based mostly on ethnicity at the time of independence. Conflicts over the distribution of resources, particularly the money coming in from the oil business, have been increased by this. Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, Nigeria's first prime minister, was deposed in a military takeover in 1966. After the Biafran Civil War began in 1967, Nigeria was ruled by the military for large periods of the following 3 decades with periodic coups. With over 4 decades of oil production behind it, had by the early 1980s become entirely reliant on the industry, which at the time contributed 25% of its GDP. Since then, as of 2008, this amount has increased to 60%. The bulk of the people has been gradually pushed to give up their traditional farming ways since the 1960s, despite the enormous riches that petroleum has generated. In the latter decades of the 20th century, there was a dramatic decline in both the annual yield of cash and food crops. Nigeria was the leading cocoa exporter in the world in 1960, but cocoa production fell by 43%. Groundnut production fell by 64%, cotton by 65%, and rubber by 29%. Even though many highly qualified and well-paid Nigerians have worked for oil companies, the bulk of Nigerians, particularly those in the far north and the Niger Delta regions, have gotten impoverished since the 1960s. Nigeria generated significant income during this time of unrest thanks to its oil resources. However, the Niger Delta's social and political turmoil was partially caused by growing environmental deterioration. The fundamental point of disagreement in this dispute is control of the advantages of oil production and the available oil resources. For the Nigerian state and its citizens, the Niger Delta War is now a significant security threat. Over the last 10 years, government troops, indigenous armed opposition, and private militias employed by oil companies have all engaged in militant actions in the Niger Delta. The major way the government reacts to the crisis is by strengthening its armed forces. Locals protest both violently and peaceably against the government's unfair distribution of oil riches and the mishandling of the oil industry. They also demonstrate against the exclusion of locals from decision-making about oil production. Due to the government's lack of protection for oil installations and employees, oil businesses in the Niger Delta respond to the unrest and violence by using armed troops from private companies. Violence in the form of kidnapping, murder, electoral violence, militant operations, and crime affects people in this conflict. Living in the Niger Delta proved to be an extremely dangerous and degraded. Some Nigerian scholars state that the Niger Delta conflict has roots in a long history of exploitation and dispossession of the region beginning during the British imperial era. First for slaves during the 17th and 18th centuries, later for palm oil during the 19th century, and finally for petroleum after Nigerian independence. The conflict has also resulted from artificial political borders drawn during British rule that resulted in nearly 300 ethnic groups being arbitrarily consolidated into a single nation-state. Causes of the conflicts. The first basis of the Niger Delta War was a battle over resources for palm oil and land rights. The socio-economic effects of the transatlantic slave trade are at the base of the conflict, which has entwined in a long history of conflicts. However, since the oil was discovered in 1958, there has been competition for control of the resource and access to the advantages associated with its production. Due to the intricacy of the Niger Delta Oil War, which is an issue entwined with political, social, economic, and environmental problems, conflict resolution, and even conflict management have proven to be highly challenging. The major reasons for this issue are the lack of diversity in decision-making over oil production, companies' lack of accountability in oil production, and the government's lack of interest in developing the Niger Delta and allocating an equitable portion of the money from oil production. Actors in the conflict. Locals in the Niger Delta, the Nigerian government, and oil companies are the three primary parties involved in the dispute. A typical response to violence is to request military protection, whether it be in the region where the enterprise is based or as a result of becoming a target. This is an instinct, particularly if you're from a nation where the military is governed politically. The army serves as an extension of an unjust government in repressive systems. An organization is put in the fight by connection with the military. This is a common issue while conducting business in conflict areas. A firm may not consider itself as participating in the conflict, but if the public believes it is because of its relationships with the military dictatorship, communities may use the company as leverage to put pressure on the government. The trial against Kensarawiwa and 8 other Ogoni tribe members, who served as leaders of the MOSOP movement for the survival of the Ogoni people, took place in Nigeria in 1995. While the firm argued and continues to assert that it is not an actor in the war, but that the dispute is between the state and the local communities, Shell's oil installations were targeted and opposition was so strong that they had to close their oil fields in the region. At the time this case study was done, the oil fields were still closed. Companies may not consider themselves to be fighters, but when other actors do, they may become targets. This is one of the key factors in the significance of business-society connections. Locals feel that oil firms abuse their land and its resources since they are not allowed to work in or have any economic control over the oil industry. Since oil is extracted on their property, the locals claim that they should get a larger portion of the revenue generated by oil extraction. The populace also recognizes the urgent need for development to eradicate poverty, environmental degradation, and health risk. Both violent and non-violent organizations, including the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People (MOSOP) and women's marches, are demonstrating against the unfair policies of the federal government and the oil industry. Violent groups include the Niger Delta Volunteer Force (NDVF) and the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta Men. The majority of categories are composed of young, jobless, educated, and illiterate individuals. The government has stepped up its militarization in reaction to the unrest and rising bloodshed in the Niger Delta. The Nigerian security forces have gone to great lengths to attempt to resolve disputes between oil companies and the local populace. For instance, the army has committed mass killings and attacks. Security forces in Nigeria also have the propensity to operate freely, and Olusegun Obasanjo's administration came under fire for not controlling the military. The Nigerian state and its allies have been charged with using armed organizations, militants, and criminals equipped with weapons to terrify anyone who disagrees with the government, in addition to the conflicts between the oil companies and the local populace. The blood drill. A war economy has emerged in the Niger Delta as a result of spiraling violence. An enormous business has developed around the destruction of oil pipelines. Here is an illustration of how it functions. A tiny ship travels beneath a pipeline, the pipeline is destroyed, the ship is loaded with fuel, and it sets sail many times to fill a tanker offshore. Basil Omiya, the country director for Shell in Nigeria, makes the following observation on this phenomenon. They don't perform appropriate tasks, therefore they leave enormous oil pollution in the aftermath of what they do. Due to the nature of the trade is illegal, many weapons are imported to defend it from being shut down by government security agents. Of course, if something is so simple to accomplish, it ruins the local economy and makes people desirous of doing nothing else. For individuals who commit these crimes, the sabotage of oil pipelines provides revenue that is used to buy weapons. Armed gangs may defend a region and the establishments they have created with the help of weapons, which encourages more sabotage and reinforces the phenomenon. In the background of official commercial activity, a network of illegal commerce exists. Additionally, it affects the modalities of governance and power structures at the local level. Young men with firearms profit as the hereditary authority of traditional leaders and elders is eroded. During a meeting with the G8, Nigerian President Umaru Yar'Adua referred to this issue as blood oil. The phrase refers to blood diamonds and the effective global battle against them. The Niger Delta Development Commission. President Olusegun Obasanjo formed the Niger Delta Development Commission (NDDC) in 2000 with the primary purpose of improving the petroleum-rich Niger Delta area of southern Nigeria. Since its founding, the NDDC has prioritized the improvement of ecological and environmental conditions as well as human growth. The Niger Delta, a densely populated region home to a variety of minority ethnic groups, was the main driving force for the creation of the NDDC. These ethnic groups created organizations in the 1990s, most notably the IYA and the Ogoni, to oppose the Nigerian government and international oil firms like Shell. The Niger Delta's minorities have persisted in their desire for more autonomy and control over the region's petroleum wealth. As a result, there are many different aspects to the Niger Delta situation. The nature of the issue has made it extremely challenging to develop potential conflict management strategies. It is vital to thoroughly analyze the dispute before developing and implementing any kind of conflict management strategy. The Niger Delta situation is referred to as an oil war by experts in the sector. Since the dispute is violent, it poses a security risk to the Nigerian government and its citizens. The Niger Delta's ecosystem and way of life have been damaged as a result of this war. Due to the absence of regulations on oil extraction and the lack of inclusivity in the decision-making process regarding oil production, both non-violent protests against oil corporations and violent protests that take the form of kidnapping, criminal activity, and electoral violence occur frequently. As it seems after the case study, initiatives from national and international authorities is currently very necessary for taming down the conflicts of Niger Delta.